Unit 6, Section 3, Key Events Relating to the Consequences of the Civil War. Today I want to talk about resistance to racial equality and what happened after Reconstruction ended in 1877. Now Southerners are free to go back to their old ways, but they're limited by the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment, which granted them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote. But just because those laws exist, and there's a Latin word for that, de jure, which means by law, just because they exist does not mean that they are actually enforced or defended, and that is de facto, and that means by reality. So the reality that existed in the South is way different than what the laws of our country said. One of the ways that Southerners are going to restrict the liberties and the freedoms and the rights of ex-slaves were literacy tests. This is an example of a literacy test that was given in the state of Alabama, and you can see that there are 4 questions up here at the top for the applicant to have to answer. Well, those could actually be memorized by the applicant without actually knowing how to read or even knowing how to write, where the registrars in the southern states and municipalities would get their affect the right of African Americans to vote is parts like this. This is an excerpt from the Constitution, and what the registrar, the voter registrar, the person who gives the applicant the right to vote, what they would do is they would have them read this, and very few could do that. African Americans could do that, and if they could read it, then they would ask them to start explaining certain parts of it, which, as you know, is a little bit above and beyond just basic literacy. And so whites in the South were able to keep a lot of African Americans from being able to register to vote. If literacy tests did not keep them from voting, then the poll taxes did. Here's a copy of an actual poll tax in 1896. The poll tax was $1.50, but then you can see assessor's fee added on, a collector's fee added on at 50 cents for a total of $2. The problem with this for all Southerners was the fact that a lot of Southerners didn't have money, white or black. And so the way they got around that in the South was something referred to as the grandfather clause. And this is an interesting exception. It said that anybody whose grandfather could vote before 1865 was excluded from having to pay the poll tax. So you can see that this is a way that white Southerners got around the poll tax where ex-slaves could not. We talked about a rebellion in 1831 known as Nat Turner's Rebellion, and we know that multiple bloody rebellions occurred in the South. One of the responses to these bloody rebellions by slaves in the South was the slave codes. Well, no longer African American slaves, so the name changed, but the rules stayed pretty much the same. They became known as the black codes. Here's an example of an actual black codes that existed in 1865 in the state of Mississippi. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was interracial relationships and marriages were deemed felonies in the state of Mississippi. This just shows you the degree of just anger that Southerners had with the rules that they instituted to separate the races after the Civil War. One group that they used to do this with, because a lot of the police institutions did not exist in the South after the Civil War, was the KKK. A term that I think you should know about the KKK is vigilante. You've probably heard the term vigilante justice. Vigilante justice is when an individual or group takes the law into their own hands. And the KKK used fear tactics like hangings, burning crosses, beatings to enforce the black codes and the purpose of the black codes was to restrict the civil liberties of African Americans living in our country. This concludes Unit 6, Section 3, Consequences of the Civil War, specifically resistance to racial equality.